everyone. Welcome to Redfall Audio Retrospective, Slaying with Sound. I'm Aaron Brown, and I was the audio lead at Arkane Austin for 2 years, and this is the presentation on how we made a bunch of the great sounds of the game. So here's the Arkane Austin audio team, which I was proud to be a part of. That's Matt Cheney, Principal Sound Designer, Emily Mayo, Sound Design, Jasmine Aguilar, Audio Producer, and a whole bunch of other people contributed there at the bottom, so I just wanted to give them all a shout out because it wouldn't have been possible without them. The topics I'm going to cover today are sound design, the C.R.A.F.T method, AK spatial volumes and portals, the WWISE mix, and maximizing music. I'm going to start it off with sound design. So the Redfall sound design aesthetic was a moody vibe, like a goth teen in rural America. Matt Cheney put it that way, and I think it's perfect. We ended up with 31,312 sound effects. I counted in WWISE. So it was a lot of work. It's grounded in reality with a hint of dark magic. There's tonality and musicality to the sound design that works with the music, and we embraced musicality in our sounds. It's a lot of dangerous and punchy layers, and layer. As you can see here in some of these screenshots, that's a Miss Whisper sound design session. Lots of layers make up a lot of these sounds. And here's a quick highlight reel to show you exactly what I mean.
Let's get moving! Coasting out. There's something over there. Heart. Destroy the heart. Destroy the body. Is fueling the heart. To destroy it, one must. Oh, look! Some sort of treasure in the heart. In theory, destroying the heart should destabilize the entire net. And my theory is correct. Let's go!
Matt Cheney designed 38 hyper-real weapons, and they all sound fantastic. I came in and polished and mixed them. I used the 1P and 3P switches in WWISE, and what we did with that is filter and pitch them so that everything has its own range and place in the mix. So it's not just volume adjustments, it's filtering and pitch that allowed the 1P and the 3P and the enemies to all come through in the final mix with clarity. For Redfall's Ambience, we had 2 huge open world maps with hundreds of interiors to cover. So we had a tiling system that dynamically loaded and unloaded things for the player as they moved around the map. We also had ARC AK ambient emitter tech that we used with WAPI to determine where a sound would be audible and only trigger when within that radius. Prevented a lot of clutter, and I'm going to go into deeper detail onto that. And finally, we had a day-night system that adjusted wind and emitter intensity based on what was happening in the map, which provided deeper immersion. We ended up with 5,735 placed emitters, and these are, as you see in these screenshots, 3D emitters placed on the interiors and exteriors to really make the world come alive. It provided much more immersion and variation, so as you're sitting in Redfall, just sit a little bit and take a listen to all the sounds in the world. The Arkane ambient tech was a blueprint that we could place into the levels, and it optimized CPU by only turning on when within the radius of a sound. And what's great about WAPI and WWISE is these values were auto-populated. So once we determined the fall off of a sound, we could pull that from WWISE automatically, click a button, and it matches that radius. Then we had a trigger margin buffer so that it wouldn't pop on and off to be precisely the radius. This made it more reactive and prevented a lot of clutter before ever hitting WWISE. Without further ado, here's some of our favorite ambiences from the game. Now to let you in on a little secret. There's an ambience Easter egg in Redfall around the Bloody Tom corpse thrall altars. So Bloody Tom has cultist art all around his corpse thrall altars. I decided to embed those in the ambience that surrounds them as well. And as you can see in this, I used a tool, Morphine, to embed it into the actual sounds. So if you record the output and inspect it, this is what shows up. And to demonstrate what that sounds like, here's a quick clip.
This is the renunciation of the symbolic. This is the elevation of the real.
Next up, the C.R.A.F.T method. C.R.A.F.T stands for Create, Reveal, Assess, Finalize, and Trust. And what the C.R.A.F.T method is a 60-90 workflow for successful rapid refinement among our team. It became clear very early on that with such a small team as you've seen in these slides, we would have to find a workflow for iteration that got us to a high quality bar with minimal effort and trusting each other. And this is what I came up with. The first step is to create. As we task things out to people, they'd work on their own, or I would work on my own, and we'd complete the assigned task to about 60% quality level. And in my experience, this is actually fairly easy to do as a creative professional. Getting to 60% on a mix, on a sound design task, and when writing music, that's the easiest chunk. Once you get there, though, is when you start to question yourself or you need feedback. So at that point, when you start to hit that, whatever that limit is, you reveal. And that's where you make a video of the work and you send it to the Slack channel. At this point, it's time for the team to assess it. We give clear, concise, actionable, constructive notes. And that's the important part. The constructive notes, being positive, trusting each other, knowing we're all here to make the game better, reducing our ego, and focusing on just making each sound as good as it can be. Then the team member takes that and finalizes the sound or whatever they're on. They iterate on it with that feedback hitting about 90% quality bar, and sometimes a few more iterations between revealing and assessing until we hit that 90% quality bar. Now, why 90% and not 100? I personally feel 100 is not a good target because going from 90 to 100 takes infinitely longer than getting to 90%. And with so many assets in the game, as you saw, 31,000 assets, it's better to get 31,000 assets to 90% than spend all that time getting to maybe 100% or 98% and leaving the other ones behind. And finally, trust. Because the craft system requires team trust. If someone doesn't trust and you're giving feedback, it might be seen in a different light. But once you trust each other and you know you're all there and you trust each other's abilities, it becomes easy to iterate and accept constructive feedback as what it is, simply trying to make the game better. And here is a video example of the start to finish of the shades. Next up, WWISE AK Spatial Technology. So WWISE spatial volumes and portals handle the spatialization of the sound in the game. And as you saw, we had an open world game with 2 districts and more, with very complex geo, with fine edges and building precision. And there's no single player path. Our game, the players could end up going anywhere they want at any time, including multiplayer, which was a huge effort for us. We ended up with 1,855 volumes and 4,813 hand-placed portals to make this all work. And you can see a snapshot of that in the overhead on the right. So the WWISE AK Spatial Check can sort of be broken down into 3 main components. The holes. The holes are the exteriors of the buildings. They have to be perfectly snapped to the exteriors, and that is what handles sounds being occluded through buildings, so you don't hear sounds on the other side of a building, and diffraction, which is around the edges of buildings, so they filter and position appropriately as enemies and objects are around corners, which gives much better gameplay than not having this at all. Also, AK Spatial Volumes. This is on the interiors, and this handles the rooms. It's the second snapshot in this slide. These handle obstruction, occlusion, and reverb for each room. And finally, portals. And in the bottom picture, you can see all these portals, which is every way in and out of a room. That includes windows, windows that can break and not break, doors, and dynamic doors. And the example shown is the Avon Clinic. That's 89 objects for a single facility that all need to be perfectly snapped and work together. The AK Spatial Tech is very tunable, and once it's done, it sounds amazing. I'm a big fan. The con is, it's a long tech ramp-up time, and it's very time-intensive to snap these things manually and build them all from scratch. It's also a complex iteration workflow. As shown here, we eventually worked with our environment artists to define exactly our workflows on the complex buildings or the basic shapes. More basic shapes we can handle with Unreal tools and build these things out. But very complex rooms, we actually worked with them to build a tool that could export from Maya to match the exact dimensions and export us a volume that works with our tech. So you can see here, working these things out was not a small task. For WWISE Reverbs, it's a part of the spatial volumes. And we used a combination of algorithmic room verb and convolution impulse responses. These are 3D positional, so they play from the actors in the world as they're in the world. So when a sound occurs on someone that's in that hall, you can hear that hall verb on them and know where they are. Or if they're in a garage while you're upstairs, you can hear that garage reverb on them, making it much more immersive and giving very cool positional information when you're in the middle of a battle. For balancing, we left the unity gain. I recommend putting 0 dB faders on your reverbs and doing balanced internally on the plugins. That made it infinitely easier to do big adjustments later. And we started with 1 to 4 bass presets to make everything functional and then match those volumes along the way. Made things much smoother by doing so. One design tip on reverbs is put a compressor pre-reverb. Now, if you have a big warehouse like we did, or a lighthouse, or anything that's got a very long decay time, putting a compressor in front of it prevents any huge overages and those tubby sounds, or just being far too loud with the reverb. Sometimes we would use reverb and convolution together. In fact, some of my favorite rooms in the game did exactly that. And that's because the algorithmic sounds different from the convolution, so the tail of the algorithmic sounded really nice mixed with the realism of the convolution. And finally, you can see this curve in the bottom right where we would dip reverb when close, and this better approximated how you hear things in the real world. As you approach a sound, it becomes more direct, and as you walk away, you hear a little bit more reverb. And here's a demo of some of my favorite reverbs in the game. In order to iterate quickly, we developed some WWISE AK Spatial debug tools. And this became critical because, as you saw, there was a lot to manage here, and making sure it worked well was critical. WWISE 3D Object Viewer is built into WWISE, so you don't even have to do anything for that other than use the profiler view and use this debug view to see all your buildings as in this screenshot. It will show you the directional path, the diffraction, the volumes. It's extremely helpful. But it wasn't quite enough. So we ended up developing with Paul MacArthur an audio markup ping tool, which became critical. It's an in-game path tool that you can place to play a looping sound. And then as you move through the world, it would show the diffraction paths as well as allow you to audition the reverbs and how it's filtering through walls and portals. We also had spatial scene details, as seen in the bottom left. And here you can see which rooms are active, which rooms are inactive, and all the portals should you choose. And in the bottom right, my favorite bit is using Remy both for her C4 as well as Brabone, our little test buddy. And Brabone, you could send in anywhere you wanted as well as have him follow you, and he would open doors and dynamic portals. And it became our favorite way to test this tech. And here's a demonstration of exactly that. And finally, for some lessons learned on the AK Spatial technology. It sounds amazing with effort, and it was worth it. However, it is time consuming for open world games, so be aware what you're getting into and ensure you have the time before you start. Don't combine lighting and audio volumes. Despite it being tempting in similar technologies, I recommend sticking with volumes that only function for audio because it's hard enough just to dial those in, as you can see here. The portals need extra tech to be allowed to fade in and out. So when you're defining that technology, make sure you add fade ins and fade outs that either time to the doors or have an approximate value, so it's nice and smooth when they're dynamically opening and closing. Define best practices early with environment art. Simple geometry is best, and if you can, get Maya exports for the geometry to get perfect snapping from the artists, that's the best. And finally, many debug tools are critical to making this work and iterating quickly. Next up, the WWISE mix. We ended up with mostly mono and stereo assets, which worked very well because there were so many 3D sounds that the positional information really filled out the sound field. For the surround mix, we did add some things to the center, such as VO, doors, locomotion, and staking. Really, any sounds that felt that the player needed that extra feedback of being there and centered got some percentage in the WWISE mixer. And soundcaster balancing became very critical. When I wanted things in a swimming lane in the mix, I would pull those categories of sounds into Soundcaster. Then I'd run the WWISE loudness meter, and I would just play all the sounds. And by doing so, it shows you in the meter what is outside the range of your expected LUFS. And LUFS, for anyone unfamiliar, is an approximation of how humans hear in a decibel range. So it adds a filter and approximates human hearing. By tracking it this way, I can quickly see which sounds are too loud or too quiet in a given category and pull them in so everything in the mix has an expected swimming lane of decibels. And the mix evaluation here shows that. Here is the category of general sounds, not every category, but many of them, and where they sat in the final mix with LUFS. So as you can see, explosions are way up around -10, and player abilities sit at, say, -15. Certain sounds like that are going to have in the very loud category. They're going to take precedence. They need to be punchy and big. And then there's other sounds that are loud, medium, quiet, and very quiet. And this chart becomes essential because it shows you the overall range you're working with and where you might have to carve out space. So say average dialogue can be audible over event explosions, as well as ensuring your categories are sitting in the approximate range as expected of your mix. Our overall mix levels ended up at -20 integrated LUFS, and the LRA was about 12 with a true peak of about -2. We didn't use any Atmos objects because we felt, well, the 3D objects that were placed were enough. We also used the WWISE Mastering Suite, which I think is fantastic, and it's free. So if you have WWISE, get this in as soon as possible. My favorite part about it is it scales effectively for all target systems. So stereo, 5.1, 7.1, 7.1.4 Atmos, it works with all of them. The settings I found that worked about the best for the master mix were a multiband compressor around a -6 dB threshold with about 1.5 or 2 ratio for each band. This wasn't anything extreme, it was just subtle control for the louder sounds and the moments that got a little too chaotic. The advanced limiter was used at around -2, which automatically switches to soft in 7.1.4 with no links on. Now on night mode, links on are nice, especially something that's not fully linked but partially linked, say around 96, 92. But for the main mix, I felt it was better without any links on because this was just barely getting touched at the very loudest moments. And finally, a tip on the WWISE Mastering Suite. Trust your ears, not just the meters. This is processing even when the meters aren't triggering, just as some plugins do. It may soften transients, it may adjust the width. So trust your ears, not the meters. For dynamic mixing, we had a fairly robust system. It was 3 main duck groups: duck high, duck low, and duck no. And those were just 3 groups of categories that we could use to duck each other based on what needed priority in the mix. It was sort of like a very, very low level HDR system. WISE meter was also used extensively, as it often is, because sidechaining is awesome. We would use it for volume primarily, but we also used it for filtering, as well as 3-band multi-band control. As you know, in Redfall, we had a lot of hip-hop music, and the hip-hop had a lot of sub-information. And we also had punchy, low-end, big, huge staking sounds. So to provide that clarity and prevent masking, you can use 3-band EQs in WISE and send a WISE meter sidechain to control the low end. So when the punchy sound kicks on, it ducks that low end in the music and allows one sound to punch through with immense clarity and precision. We also use the WISE time modulator, which ducks music over 20 seconds. Now this prevented fatigue because at first the music was very impactful and it gave the information you needed. But occasionally, if it sat around for more than 20 seconds, you would find that it took up a little too much space in the mix and could be a little fatiguing. So over 20 seconds, we wrote it to be a little bit quieter because the player's aware of it, they've already heard it, and they're used to it. They've adapted. But by having it there a little quieter, left more space in the mix and prevented fatigue. And finally, WISE LFOs were used extensively. On any sort of static loops, WISE LFO will breathe fresh life by giving infinite variation, particularly with the random slow LFOs. You can use those for filtering, you can use those for volume, and provide an infinite variation to your sounds. For the mix environments, we mostly relied on virtual headphone systems. And this is because we were mostly remote. We had an on-site office, but to achieve parity between the 3 of us and the off-site and on-site rooms, we relied on the VSX system, which I'm wearing right now. I've been using this for years. I'm a big fan. I actually sold 5 other pair of headphones once I bought these. So this is for stereo and monitor consumer testing. It provides system-wide support so you can listen back to your game in stereo or put it in your DAW and design in stereo. You can listen back on mono. You can do a card test if you want. You can listen on consumer earbuds. It's very versatile, it's very accurate, and it provided transparency and equal translation between all of the team. Another one that was fantastic is Embody Immerse. Embody Immerse is an Atmos solution, or 5.1 or 7.1.4. What's great about that is it's personalized HRTF. That's PHRTF. For anyone that hasn't used that, try out PHRTF. It basically scans your head and provides a personalized HRTF. So when you put the headphones on, it's very accurate and positional as if you were actually there in the fake room. I really like the Game Reference Studio and Alan Meyerson for anyone that wondered. And finally, for playing in Atmos in-game, we use Dolby Atmos PHRTF. That's right. They also have PHRTF, and I recommend you check that out. For me, if the headphone system does not have PHRTF, no deal. Once you hear PHRTF, there's no going back. And a few mix lessons learned. Mix early and mix often. The earlier you mix and get things into categories with input and output levels expected to the team, the better. And that way, as you approach deadlines, you're spending more time mixing and less time fixing. For VO levels, I recommend 3 minimum specs, at least whispered, spoken, and yelled. It's going to make mastering a lot easier in the long run and batch processing a lot easier rather than trying to rely on one to rule them all. More is even better, but 3 is a good minimum. And multiplayer players play with volumes from 5 to 20% in the sliders. Now, this was a big discovery for me. I knew players turned down sounds. I usually thought it would be 35 or 50 as I do. But in a poll, we found 15% was the average Windows volume that players leave it at when in multiplayer. So when you're designing your mix for a multiplayer game, be aware you probably want some mastering suite presets or volume testing in those specific scenarios so they're getting the critical information. It's part of why the mix ended up louder on Redfall than the minus 23 LUFS. And Atmos focus, as you're employing Atmos, define your objects early if you do want those, because routing them later can be a little difficult. And when you're authoring, author LCR and multi-channel assets for Atmos surround from the start, because doing it later is difficult. And finally, dynamic systems for chaotic battle. When you're defining your systems, it's better to cull the sounds prior to ever hitting WWISE. Use things like the importance of an enemy, the threat level of an enemy. Use those things to control what sounds are audible prior to ever having to do dynamic mixing in WWISE, and it will be a lot easier to manage. And finally, maximizing music. We had a wonderful composer, Jean-Nic Bontemps, who did an excellent job on the soundtrack with spooky hip-hop that really brought the world alive. But we had to find a way to maximize his wonderful material to spread across the game of our scope. One method we used was the music effector system. This is a priority system above WWISE that's in Unreal that controls what gets called at WWISE. It's using an AI rule set of gameplay states as well as enemy types for basic faction awareness. And these music effectors could be called in blueprints or sequences, and we could also disable it should we want to override it or push a different type of sound that prevented states from controlling our music. We also had a music manager with a debugger that showed the priorities, the state, and the particular requester, so we could make sure things are working as expected. And Emily Mayo did a wonderful job of chopping up the music and rearranging it as shown in a few of these screenshots. What's even better is JB delivered music that worked in this manner. And I would say for anybody that needs to do this, work with a composer like JB that gives you material that allows you to do this. It's not written in one particular way. It has multiple layers that can be pulled apart and repurposed and restructured. And he did an excellent job at that. And Emily did a wonderful job in just maximizing that material. We also set up diverse playlist orders and randomized tracks. That way, when something occurred the same way, it wouldn't be heard the same way. So this was similar material to be identifiable to the player, but not the exact same material to be annoying to a player. And here are some of those systems in a demo video. One other cool part of the music system is Emily Mayo's idea to have unique instruments per character. So we had a variety of things you could play in the game: a toy piano, a grand piano, a church organ, guitars, and more. And Emily's idea was to take each character profile and build unique playability based on their profile. So Devinder was a classically trained, intelligent piano player, whereas Jacob played the acoustic guitar. And the other characters, well, they played to a varying degree of success, as demonstrated in this video. And as a few tips of what we learned from the Redfall music system, go as deep as you can with data hooks. Get as many in as you can as early as possible, because the more you have, the more reactive you can make things, and the more dynamic the music will be. As you build the music systems, decouple your tables from the AI values that you receive. They're always going to be tuning them, as they should be. And by having your own tables that are decoupled from them, that exist separately, it gives you more ability to tune them without being reliant upon their values. As well as get some sort of timer, cooldown, ADSR into your music tools as soon as possible, because that allows you to prevent auto-triggering right away, and it allows you to do things on whatever you feel sounds best and is emotionally evocative for the player in the correct setting. And finally, some other lessons learned is that multiplayer takes about 3 times the time of regular single-player games. This is time to test, to iterate, to jump on multiplayer, to get in, to sync, to build the multiple assets that really make it work. It's about 3 times the time in my estimation. Video sharing everything regularly is critical, particularly with everybody being remote. So get that handbrake shortcut using the YouTube video I have, and just get in a habit with your team of sharing as often as possible. The more you share, the more it becomes routine, and the easier it is to share with other teams as well, the cool work that you and your team is achieving. Document everything. This became critical for contractors such as Mac Owens, who came on and onboarded very quickly, thanks to the documentation we had for onboarding, as well as for other team members to come and jump on and assist as you're placing emitters and there's an emitter tutorial, or as everyone had to jump on and make volumes, and we had very clear instructions on how to do so. More documentation makes everything better, and anyone who knows me knows I love my documentation. And finally, WWISE installs for QA and engineering. Make sure you give the QA team and engineering team some way to quickly install WWISE, as well as directions on running the profiler. When they're doing their hard work and finding bugs, it's very beneficial to give them a little bit of extra access so they could get you, say, an F6 profile session of the bug, or the actual name of the asset, or the volume, or any deeper information other than the audio is broken in some way. And that's it. Thanks for listening, and check out Redfall on Game Pass, and be sure to take in all the sounds and the work our team put into that game. If you found anything interesting in this talk and want to talk more, my contact information is below. Definitely reach out, and I look forward to talking with you in the future. Thanks for coming by.